Hello and welcome back to another episode of Into the HEMAverse, your guide for everything going on in the HEMAverse. I am Colin Vredenberg, and here again with my co-hosts, as always, David Rao and Nathan Graperes. Today we've got a interesting episode. No guest this time. We are talking specifically about longswords and longsword fencing. But first, let's do some quick news. Another reminder, right off the bat, Patreon. We have one. It's really cool. There is bonus content. You should check it out at patreon.com/intothehemaverse. A part of it is actually a monthly AMA that we are still in the process of scheduling. But if you have questions for that AMA that you'd like to submit, you can either submit them in the comments section of this video, or you could submit them to intothehemaverse@gmail.com. Either way, we will read your question and hopefully answer it on air. That would be pretty cool. The AMA is scheduled to be live, and it will probably be on a weekend, Friday night kind of deal. Let's see. Oh, right. Nathan reminded me that Michael Chittister's HEMA bookshelf for facsimiles is still ongoing. He is doing facsimiles of... this time it's Fiore's Flower of Battle, but he's also done... Oh, what was the one that he did first?
Talhofer.
Talhofer, thank you.
And if you get in and on the Fiore one now, you can also get Talhofer as well.
Yes, which is really, really cool. The facsimiles look gorgeous. I have definitely ordered one for myself. So if you are interested, that's really cool. His site where he updates information on that is HEMA Bookshelf. It's facebook.com/HEMA Bookshelf. Speaking of Facebook, we also have one. So for our YouTube subscribers that are new, definitely check us out on Facebook. It is facebook.com/intothehemaverse. You could search Into the HEMAverse. We'll show up. There's that classy picture of the three of us superimposed into the the Marozzo. What would you call that? It's not a plate, but
no, it's not. Yeah, it's not a. It's
I wouldn't know. I guess like just
picture.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Nice. Done for us by Mariana Lopez, which is really amazing. It looks gorgeous. But if you find that, then you found us on Facebook, give us a like or a follow. We'd really appreciate it. Cool. So let's get right into talking about longswords, because I think this might be a long episode, and I'd like to try to keep it to an hour. Let me just say that I have the least experience with longsword. I have fought in a total of one total longsword tournament ever in my whole life, wherein I was taken out in the second round of elims by Hank, of course. Hank McLemore of Virginia Academy of Fencing. We were against each other. And the second longsword tournament that I've ever been in, I made it to the first round of elims where my ACL snapped and I was no longer able to continue. So not a lot of experience there. However, these two yokels are both top 100 longsword fencers, according to HEMA ratings, and have had tons of years of experience of longsword tournaments. Then they're going to be our experts for today, and I'm going to be asking them questions. So, first question: what is a longsword?
David.
It's a sword that's long?
It's kind of a complicated question. I think I say that a lot.
Is it like a claymore?
Yes, it's exactly like a claymore. It's also a broadsword.
And a broadsword.
And a greatsword. They're all the exact same thing.
Hand and a half, bastard.
Actually, I mean, the thing is that the term longsword, meaning like a two-handed sword like this, which is not a really, really big two-handed sword. Like it's big enough that you hold it and you use it in two hands, but it's not like what we think of as a big two-handed sword. Calling that a longsword is actually a modern anachronism. I don't know when people first started doing that, but in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and after that, I mean, the term was just spada in Italian, or whatever language. They're just saying sword usually. And one of the main reasons that longsword, like before HEMA, like 1990s HEMA, I think when a lot of people said the word longsword, they just meant a sword that was long. So like, I know if you read, oh God, what's from the early 20th century, the guy that goes, John Carter, he goes to Mars, the science fiction from the early 20th century. Anyways, he has a longsword, but the longsword I'm pretty sure is one-handed, and it's almost more like a rapier or something like that. So they would call it a longsword, but it's really just because it's a long sword. But with HEMA, people started using the word longsword because I think mainly in the Liechtenauer tradition, this is called, fencing with, and this was translated as fencing with the longsword. However, it's kind of a mistranslation, because literally what the text says is fencing with the like lengthened or extended sword, as opposed to fencing with the shortened sword, meaning fencing long, or fencing with the long sword, is where you use it in both hands on the hilts, and it's so all the strikes, everything you do, it's out basically so you can get better reach with it. Whereas when you go to half sword or do the shortened sword, which is primarily used in armored combat, but also used in like close in grappling and stuff, you're shortening the sword because you're grabbing it here. So your reach is much shorter, but you also have much better leverage. And again, that's called fencing with the short sword or the shortened sword. But again, when people say the word short sword, they think of a single-handed sword.
Yeah.
But
that's D&D's fault. Let's be clear.
Right. But basically, in modern parlance now, when someone says a long sword, they're usually meaning, at least in a HEMA context, they're meaning a two-handed sword that is usually can be used in one hand as well. So it's usually, like in the various texts that we see with the longsword, there's techniques where you take a hand off of it. And it's not the same as what we think of it like as the big two-handed swords, like the spadone or the montante, although there's an argument there to be made that they're not that different either.
Yeah, actually, and I think David Rawlings made that point. He's like, really, they're not that different. They're longer, obviously, but they're not. It's not like a completely different weapon. It still kind of fits the same. Also, I noticed that some of the bigger longswords in HEMA actually, maybe this is wrong, and you guys can correct me. It seems like some of the bigger longswords, like the Siggy XLs and like Encifers that are like big long swords, those are almost more sized like a Spadone than they are what we would consider like a Meyer era longsword that you would fence with. Yes, no?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
No?
No, I was going to say yes and no, just like you did.
No. Okay. I was going to say, yeah. Do you want to explain?
Oh, I mean, I there's those images in the Goliath manuscript, I think it is, where they've got like gigantic swords and they're using them like long swords, and I think they're called long swords there as well.
Mm.
Yeah,
that's all reference.
I mean, it's just a copy of an earlier gloss of Liechtenauer.
Right.
So yeah, and what they're probably doing is just depicting. They're depicting the sword that was what they thought of as like a two-handed sword, whereas 50 years earlier than that, 100 years earlier, right? That might not have been the same idea. And yeah, so like when you say like what is a medieval or when is whatever like a Renaissance longsword, the answer is there's so many things, so many different examples of sword lengths and hilt lengths and blade lengths and ratios that to make a blanket statement about anything is, I would say, pretty like almost disingenuous.
Okay, so I mean that's a fantastic explanation, by the way, and that's really really helpful. Why do you guys think that we in HEMA circles specifically pick out the longsword? Like, why do we categorize the longsword as we do? Why do you think that is? It's a tough question.
Yeah, restate it.
I have my ideas, and maybe I'll kind of start with this one. There's a lot of different reasons why you would categorize something for any reason, but it seems to be we want to categorize it for two reasons, and they kind of overlap a little bit. One is the time period of relevancy, which is like this is like an earlier period sword. Like it's definitely active in the 15th century, whereas like a rapier would not be. And two, because when we are competing in tournaments, we usually like to have like weapons versus like weapons, and so this categorization kind of keeps us on the path of like almost like we're trying to keep it all in this one time period of the time period of relevancy, but also because we don't want to institute kind of a mixed weapons system. We want to keep it like, how are you with two hands on the sword? How are you with two hands on the sword? Fight it out and see who's better. That's just my thoughts on it.
That was my guess as well. I mean, some sort of standardization is, I think, necessary. Otherwise, you're going to end up with people who have, an early period longsword. It's not even like a fetter, like one of these, right? Mm-hmm. That are quite a bit shorter than like the Siggy that David was just showing. You're gonna end up with somebody that's got one of those going up against somebody who has like a Zweihander or something like that. And it's like, are we even playing the same game anymore? Because it doesn't look like we're playing the same game.
Well, and even though I would say there's definitely a value to be learned from mixed weapons exchanges, totally valuable. I learned so much trying to fence a longsword with sword and buckler, and believe me, I would take sword and buckler in most fights. And if I had to fight a longsword with not a longsword, I'd probably take sword and buckler, but it's still difficult as hell. So I think there's definitely to be learned, but I think you're right. I think that it needs to be standardized so that we are legitimately testing skill, we're legitimately testing speed, we're legitimately testing source knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, there are tournaments that are kind of like open, like bring whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a reason that, like, for instance, those kind of things aren't counted on HEMA ratings because you're not getting good statistics, right? Because there's so many variables in the mix.
Mm-hmm.
And while that's sort of historical, if you're thinking of like a self-defense or even potentially like a battlefield type of situation where you might have a mismatch, at the same time, it's not historical at all when you're looking at dueling. In the duel, you had to have like your weapons had to be the same, basically.
Yeah, or I'd say even the Sal, right? Meyer doesn't really depict much, or at all. I don't think there's not a single mixed weapon set in Meyer. I don't think.
No.
Yeah.
I don't think so.
The only mixed weapon from that time period that I know of is actually much later. It's Tybalt. He does a lot of mixed weapons. He does rapier versus sword and buckler, sword and shield, and he does rapier versus rapier and dagger, and he also does rapier versus longsword. But those are the only ones that I know of. So I would assume, again, this is a huge assumption, that there wasn't a lot of mixed weapons in the Sal.
Well, yeah, the rapier treatises tend to cover a lot of mixed weapons, but they're usually at the end, and it's kind of like, if you need it, here's what you do. right? You also see a lot of like I was thinking Meyer does have unarmed versus dagger.
That's true. Yeah.
But you weren't allowed to grapple in like a lot of the textual rules. But Meyer's not sport fencing, so he also is.
It's all sport fencing.
It's all sport fencing.
Oh boy, we're getting into the the big time takes already. The hot takes.
Somebody,
The,
somebody made one of those memes I saw a couple weeks ago. It was like the one with the astronauts looking at Earth, and there's the astronaut behind him that's got like the gun pointed to his head, and then like the first one is like, wait, it's all sport fencing? Always has been.
Always has been.
that came out in July, like literally right after our episode where we.
You did.
It did.
Was that? Did someone listen to that and then post it? It was retweeted, but I thought it was really hilarious that came out like right after we recorded. We talked about how everything is.
To be fair, we also made that episode because it had been brought up in a lot of HEMA channels again. Because it's cyclical. That will come up. That will usually come up, about twice a year,
right?
Where somebody asks a question. Usually a beginner who's just like legitimately trying to ask, and then starts this huge open can of worms debate. But yeah,
there are two things that are eternal in all of HEMA: debates about sport fencing versus martiality, and footwear.
And footwear.
Whenever we get bored about fighting about other things, we fight about those.
Oh. That's what our next episode should be about shoes.
Oh man, I would love it. I have like 1,000 pairs of shoes.
No matter what we say, we're gonna get like 1 million views because everyone has an opinion.
Yeah, no, I mean you're right. So it's funny though because like my opinions are well researched because I literally own I think every different kind of. I have wrestling shoes, I have fencing shoes, I have sport shoes, I have Onitsuka Tigers that are like the super fencing ones from whatever. Anyway, longswords. What are your thoughts on the relevancy of time period? Because I mentioned that, and then we didn't really talk about it too much. What time period were longswords like historically relevant? And do you think that that's a part of our categorization methodology?
I mean, as anybody who's been following the podcast series knows, like the longswords maintain relevance even at least as just like a sporting weapon well into the 17th century.
Mm-hmm.
And like with the Belgian fencing guilds that were doing it probably even longer than that. And then there was of course the resurgence of the Victorian era.
We're gonna presume, and I apologize. We're gonna presume there's a lot of newcomers to the podcast after our Matt Easton video, and that we need to catch them up a little bit. Just give context, but that's great. Yeah, no, I think that the longsword has been used on the battlefield and in the South for a huge number of years. I think Meyer talks about it as being like, this is the manliest of all weapons, or some other such toxic masculinity. What was that, David? Sorry, say it again.
It's the queen of weapons, the most noble. I believe.
Oh.
Yeah. Who's toxic masculinity now, Colin?
I mean, the earliest longsword treatise that we have is Fiore.
Mm-hmm.
1409, I want to say.
That sounds right, but I'm not.
I don't do Fiore, so I have an excuse.
It's 1409 and a half.
There you go.
It's July of 1409.
I believe he was like 60 years old. So the art that he's teaching and he says is something that he learned like in his youth. So we're talking about a mid 14th century art in theory. Now, but this time we get to the beginning of the 15th century, in the 1400s. How much of it is the same as it was 60 years before? He's saying that, but he's also been teaching for however, we don't know exactly, I don't know exactly how old he was, 50, 60, 70, whatever he was. He's been teaching for a long time, and I will say that anyone who teaches for a long time, you definitely start like throwing away things and being like, don't worry about this is important, don't do this. So like 14th century. But even you can go earlier than that and look at 13th, I think I want to say even 12th century,
Mm.
where you start seeing like one-handed swords where they're gripping in images or gripping with both hands in order to like make a more powerful blow. And that's probably where long swords kind of like it's like someone was like, hey, why don't I make this longer so I can do that easier.
I can poke you from further away.
Exactly.
Okay, so actually, I'm glad this actually segues really, really well into the next topic I wanted to go through, which is the main traditions that we study in HEMA for the longsword. And as far as I am aware, there are really two main traditions. There are Italian Fiorists, and there are Liechtenauer tradition, which you can like. Some people pick and choose where in the Liechtenauer tradition they choose, like they want to study, but for the most part, those seem to be like the two main branches. Yes.
It's defended all of the English longswords, all five of them.
What? So what? I mean, what English long? What are you talking? What are you?
So there are a couple of there are a couple of English longsword treatises. Very few people study them because they're kind of like Liechtenauer. They're written in almost like a code.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Well, talk about that a little bit because it's
yeah. So it's actually very interesting, but they're very, very difficult to understand. And so, like any extrapolation from them is very, very theoretical.
Mhm.
What is really interesting is people have pointed out more recently that there seems to be a lot of correlation between that and German longsword, even in terms of like the words that are used. I don't have an example. But there was I don't remember example, but there was example, for instance, like Zerk in German longsword.
Yep.
To cut like a cross. I think there's some similar idea in the English longsword, and the word like they use like the quarter or something like that is even linguistically kind of similar. So there's some interesting things like that. But yes,
is it like hunting terminology too?
But you are basically correct, at least for the early longsword, if you want to say 15th century longsword. You have the Italian tradition of Fiore, and then later body. Body. I don't do Italian. Body is still 15th century, yes. So it might have been the beginning of the 16th century. I don't remember. And then you have Liechtenauer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when you're trying to talk about like what longsword do you do, most people, to be honest, it's German longsword. And then
it's really easy to tell because usually they'll have like they'll say it up front, like this is German longsword specifically, which I think was kind of nice. When I first went to VAF, they were like, well, Bill Grandy in his intro, we do German longsword. Okay, there's this whole other thing that's an Italian. It's great. Fiore is really cool. I mean, his whole treat. No.
No, actually, Fiore is much cooler than Liechtenauer.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, because Liechtenauer, like, we only really know what we do based on the students and the whatever, and then trying to decipher his verse, right? Because Liechtenauer, in its quote-unquote original state, is really just one big long thing of verses, and it's all coded. I forget what I was either reading or we were talking about before, maybe on the podcast, maybe not, but it's coded in such a way that if you were a student of Liechtenauer, it would be kind of like a reminder, right? Like of this is remember you learned this thing, right? I taught you this thing. It's not so much
almost.
Yeah, it's not like trying to teach you anything. It's just like fight strength with weakness and weakness with strength. That's what you should do. Remember I showed you that. But yeah, so like, whereas like Fiore is like, no. When the guy comes up on you, right, with a dagger, you're gonna execute this throw, and then when he's down on the ground, you stab him 37 times with his own dagger, and then you sit on him and wait for other people to come to watch him bleed out.
Even better, right? Because actually, Fiore does have verse as well, like the Liechtenauer verse where it says, yeah, whatever, do whatever, and then you have someone, a student, or we assume students of Leishman are writing, this is what he's talking about. Footnote, it's potentially possible that those people didn't actually know what they were talking about either. or that they had access to Leichenauer's verse, but they didn't actually know what he was talking about, and they're like, I think this is what he was talking about. Let's just throw that out there.
I was gonna say, if I had to write a treatise of all the things that you taught me, it would look like crap. You've taught me some fantastic things, but if I had to write them down and try to teach them to somebody else, it would not go over well.
But yeah, the mnemonic device of like a rhyming poetry is really common in the Middle Ages for learning craft, meaning like craft is something you do with your hands, not like arts and crafts, making things and
popsicle sticks.
Yes, exactly.
And pipe cleaners.
So it's like work. I'm not explaining it well, but anyways, so oral traditions were really common for passing along information because you can memorize it and then use that to remind yourself of what it means, especially if you're not literate and you can't read.
Yeah.
And that's why in the 14th, 15th century is when you start seeing all the treatises, because literacy starts going up and you start seeing a very like scholastic tradition, and people like, let's record stuff and write stuff down much more than previously in like scientific kind of stuff. But anyways, long story, or I went the long way around.
Long story.
Longsword. The best difference between you kind of mentioned this is that, you know, Leichenauer says, give me a verse, Nathan.
Give you a verse?
I like the weak with strong and strong with weak, right? That's one of his verses, right?
Let hang go through for the Durklaufen. Like give you like a few lines or like an entire verse.
So that's what the Leichenauer verse will be like, right? It will be like point
long, strike to the crum to the masters, or strike the crum to the hands of the flats of the masters, and so on and so forth.
Exactly. And then you have, this means that when you come to your opponent in the approach, you do this, and then they do this, and you do this, and you do this. And Fiore is like, has this very kind of flowery poetry of like, kind of like Leichenauer, like what you're supposed to do. And then Fiore himself is telling you, okay, here's what you do. You go up to him, you grab his sword, you fucking break his arm, and you throw him down to hell. Then actually, I mean, he doesn't say fucking, but you better not bleep out the throw him down to hell, because
that's the part that I won't bleep out the F word, but I will bleep out the hell part, because
you can't censor Funky Fiore.
No, but yeah, I think that's really the crux of it, right? And then so like, and I would also say like the Leichenauer tradition extends like well beyond. I would even say, I mean, maybe this is not a good argument, but I would consider like Meyer is in the Leichenauer tradition. So it kind of just sort of, it continues, right? Lev, I think, is in the Leichenauer tradition, so which is what Nathan's been reading for sure. But it's sort of like, this is the tradition from this tree, and over here is the tradition from the Fiore tree, and that's kind of just how the so a lot of times in HEMA we'll say like, oh, this person is a Fiorist, or this person is a Meyerist, or this person is whatever.
Yeah. So
speaking of that, what do you guys practice?
I just make shit up.
Yeah.
It's all sports. You mean it's all sport fencing?
Always has been.
Always has been. No. Because I would say you guys are both German longswordists, obviously. David, I think you're more of just like a general Leichenauer. I don't think you you definitely take from all over the place. But I would say general Leichenauer, right?
So, just major actually. It's a terrible joke. So I started. Well, let's make a differentiation between like when I fence and when I'm teaching. So what I teach is basically from it's the Lichtenauer tradition. I primarily teach out of so there's like four main glosses of Lichtenauer, and they're all more or less saying the same thing, but like some of them leave out some things, or some of them explain the technique differently, or explain a part of the technique that's not there, or they do actually a different technique and call it the same thing. So you have I'm just going to use the common names that they're known by, which is not what the manuscripts are actually called. So you have the Danzig treatise, you have the Ringek treatise, you have Lev, and then you have what's often called the Döbringer treatise, which is also, in theory, potentially the earliest one, and it's also the one that's the most different from the other three.
All right, so we didn't really cover this, but Nathan, would you say you're a Mayerist?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
No.
Because I know that you teach Meyer.
No, okay, so I've been doing HEMA for like almost 10 years in November, I think, and teaching it for probably 4-ish years. Most of that time I've been teaching at Ringek because it was one of the readily available like actual physical books. I would for a long time I used the Wichtenauer like compendium that was like 3 different sources, I think, and that's what we would work out of. I much prefer early period fencing to later period stuff myself. And we were working on Meyer just because, like, we had been, when we started making the podcast, and also shortly after the COVID stuff hit, we had been working with Meyer because it's very well worded. It's very specific, and it's easier to teach that kind of thing over like a video medium where you don't have to like see somebody's feet and like look at them and correct them and give them all of the specific changes and tweaks that you might need to make if the words are a bit more vague, right? If you're teaching to a group of 10 people and the explanation is a little bit vague, you can have people there to ask questions and say, well, what do you mean by this? Do I step like this, or is it like this, and so on and so forth. But if you're teaching to the same 10 people and it's a remote audience, it's a lot better to be like, okay, you put this foot exactly in this spot, you strike exactly with this edge from exactly on this side to this particular angle. It's a lot more specific, and so it's easier to teach remotely. And like we had run through a lot of the Ringek stuff, so I was like, let's just pick up Meyer and let's play around with Meyer a little bit, because I do also try to dispel the myth amongst my guys that like Meyer is this completely different thing, because he's not that different. There are some differences, but he's not a completely different lineage of fencing. It's Lichtenauer with very little thrusting is almost what it is.
Yeah, and so like when I was trying to like choose what beginners pay attention. When I was trying to choose what I really wanted to learn, obviously I'm going to learn anything that David teaches me, and he's my primary, he's my primary student, or I'm his, blah, he is my primary teacher. So, but when I was looking at other like manuscripts that I wanted to read and things to get into it, Meyer just like was just right there. And it was like, it was clear, it was concise. There's YouTube videos all over the place of different people doing Meyer stuff. And I was just like, yeah, this kind of makes sense for me, honestly. And it's not that different from what David's teaching me. The difference being that I need to know what my point is and how to put it into the other guy, which is I would say very important.
So I realized when I was talking earlier, I started rambling and actually didn't get to my point, which was that I started with the early Lichtenauer stuff, and I've done that for 20 years. I mean, literally 20 years now. And I started back, like, I think it was 2011, 2012, right around the time when the Long Point first happened.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, oh, let me start looking at Meyer rather than Ringek or Danzig. I don't think there's a translation of that. And I started to do it, and then I was like, like I worked some with like the Dusak and stuff, and then I was like, whatever. And then I was like, all right, Sword and Buckler is my thing now. So I spent all my time working on Sword and Buckler mostly, and while still doing Lichtenauer. But I've been doing it for so long that I kind of almost got burnt out on it. Except I'm still primarily teaching that when I'm teaching longsword. Not that I've taught anything since March, unfortunately. But this year I have only looked at Meyer, both his 1560 earlier treatise and then his 1570 treatise. And then there is a treatise that was mentioned a few episodes back with Bert Hader about, it's called, it doesn't really have a good name. It's called like a new treatise on this like art-rich fencing. And it's another it's a late like 1590, so it's a late 16th century fencing treatise.
Is that the Heinrich von Gutterold?
No, that's another one. But it's a really kind of bizarre, but also really interesting treatise. So I've been spending all of my time trying to figure that out, because it's even in some ways it's more confusing than like Liechtenauer is, because it's like really sparsely worded. So I don't know. It's something to occupy my time. But then I've been doing a lot of time with Meyer, because like I'd read it through Meyer before, but I never really spent a lot of time really researching. And this year I've only been looking at Meyer for longsword.
Interesting. So it's like we came to Meyer at the same time, sort of independently, because I didn't know you were doing that. That's really cool. We all kind of came to Meyer this year. Ta-da!
Now Nathan has left.
Yes. As soon as I found the Udalev book, I was like, "Ooh, man, this is some good stuff." Like it is Ringek if Ringek used more words, and Meyer if he was less self-aggrandizing.
You know what? On that recommendation, I'm gonna get that book.
Dude, get it. It's blue and yellow.
It's a great
Well,
version.
my colors are blue and gold. I wanna.
Okay, fine. It's blue and gold.
No, that his colors are blue and yellow. It's like yellow. It's not gold. Anyway, let's move on and give a little something for the beginners out there. How do you best recommend someone get started learning longsword?
With a coach.
Yep, I would 100% agree.
I mean, I was kind of being a smart ass, but don't try to learn fencing on your own. Just don't do it. We all made that mistake many years ago, and it took us a long time to get free of that. Find a coach.
Yeah.
That's important. And it doesn't matter what tradition. It doesn't even matter. Like, if the only thing that you have in your area is sport fencing, go do sport fencing for a year and then try working on treatises, because
learn how to move, man.
Yeah, until you know how to move, until you understand like trying to defend, like defense and offense, and have some kind of framework that you can think about fighting. Reading a fencing treatise is just going to be like your brain is just going to be like, I have no idea, so you're just going to like make things up. So if you can find a coach, and of course with like COVID happening right now, there are lots of people doing online lessons.
Yeah.
And
which is weird, because it's like it's a fantastically weird opportunity. I got to learn a little bit from Nathan from his stuff, which was really cool. I got to learn, and so like, it's, first of all, COVID sucks, okay, and I want it over with as soon as possible so I can get back to VAF and get back to training and get back to going to tournaments, because it sucks. But I love Tybalt. There is literally no one within 1,000 miles of me teaching Tybalt. David Rawlings has been teaching Tybalt online for the past few weeks, and I've started to take classes with him, and I'm like, yes, finally, I have this opportunity. Without COVID, I would never have been able to study under David Rawlings. I would never have been able to do that. But it's like it's such a weird like opportunity, and
Yeah.
I definitely want beginners to take advantage of that, because you could now pretty much learn from anybody with online content, and you can learn almost any material. There's a lot of coaches who even give you feedback. Like, it's not just online lectures. It's like a Zoom class where they'll say, hey, I think I saw can you do that footwork thing for me again? Can you do that footwork again? Hey, that's wrong. You should do it this way instead because this, and this. You can actually get feedback on it and everything. It's really awesome. Sorry, that was just my personal rant for the day. Okay, I'm done.
It's like I always see people posting online. It's like, hey, I've always wanted to learn this, but there are no clubs within 200 miles of me. Now there's tons of content online, and there's, like you said, you can hire instructors to teach you like private lessons and to give you personal instruction. So there's no excuse now. If you're not doing HEMA, then you're a bad person.
The only the only excuse that is possible is if you don't have an internet connection, which I totally understand. I don't know how you're watching this podcast, but if you don't have an internet connection, that's your one excuse.
I'll throw something else out there. David had mentioned find a coach. Start learning HEMA like that. Contrary to that, like I had been just playing around with swords in the backyard kind of thing for a very long time. And if that's all that you can do, if you've got like a neighbor or a friend who lives by you and you're like, don't pick up a source and try to learn what the source is trying to tell you, but just like try to bash each other with swords, right? And you'll learn. And then whenever you do end up finding a school or you do end up, getting some online lessons or whatever, you will have developed more like intuitive understandings of how to move and how to swing a sword and stuff like that, because there's a certain amount of truth in like, if it feels awkward with the way that you're stepping and swinging a sword, you're probably doing it wrong. And if you do it enough, you'll accidentally find out a way that feels more right. And then you will begin breeding correct technique.
Mm-hmm. You know what? And on the back of that, I will say that there is a big stigma around just learning things in general, like learning new skills, that usually comes with a fear of creating bad habits. And I had a teacher a long time ago that told me that basically if you're scared of, actually he was a baseball coach, but he said if you're scared of creating or learning bad habits, just quit and walk off the field right now, because everybody is going to learn a bad habit at some point, and you need to learn how to work out your bad habits. Being scared of a bad habit is not a good thing. You should always try, and if you create a bad habit, it stinks, work through it. And it's a challenge, but you'd rather have that challenge than not learn anything at all. And if you're kind of scared, you're not going to learn anything. You need to get out there. You need to do something. So yeah, I very much agree with you, Nathan.
And also just, objectively, if you learn a bad habit and then you have to unlearn the habit and then relearn the correct way of doing that thing, you've learned two things now.
Yeah. And almost always, in almost every situation where I had, because I used to help doing, I was a hitting coach for a couple of years. If you have a bad habit and you learn your way out of that bad habit, you're everything you're doing gets better immediately. So like you're almost better. I would say 9 times out of 10, you're better off than have just learned it the right way the first time.
Yeah, and you can go even further and say that sometimes bad habits can be useful because they can be unexpected, and they can, you can pull, especially if you've learned to do it the right way, you can do the wrong things at the right time and mess with your opponent.
That is a big brain take. I like it. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. One of the things.
No such thing as a bad technique, only a bad time to use it.
Yeah, so I love that, because there's something that I do in my fencing, and actually Nathan I think does it as well, which is purposely perform something badly the first time, so that somebody sees that and they're like, oh, I got the scouting report on you now, and then do it right the second time and they're screwed.
There was that reminds me. There was a couple of years ago at Capital Clash, and it was in the I think it was in the gold medal match. The guy that I was fighting, it was either that one or the one before it. But the guy that I was fighting, I had watched him fence for like most of the tournament, and he was I think he came from a sport fencing background, and he was consistently like sprinting out of the ring. And so I was like, all right, well, all that I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna like parry and sidestep and just make him run himself out. And so like the match starts and I'm over like on the edge of the ring on purpose because I don't want him to like blow past me and stay in the ring. I wanted to ring himself out so that like I get points, right? And someone in the crowd is like, Nathan, you're by the edge of the ring. Be careful. And in my head, I'm like, shut up. I know what I'm doing. I know I'm by the edge of the ring. Shut up.
Yeah, I remember that match. It was hilarious because you were literally bullfighting. You were like,
Yeah, I was like, bye.
And then he would charge you and you go, whoop, and you'd run out of the ring and get a penalty for it. It was amazing. And that, so you'd either like sidestep or you'd like parry and hit him as he ran out. It was fantastic. But I remember having that exact same thought. Someone yelling. I heard someone yelling like, "You're near the ring." I wanted to yell back like, "He knows what he's doing," because it was really obvious what you were doing. Just
no,
it was obvious to everybody but his opponent, I think, and that's the best part, where it's just like everybody knows what you're doing. Everybody knows what you're doing, except for that one guy who's like, "Oh, I'm gonna get him this time," right?
I think a lot of people don't necessarily like. You have to have a certain level of experience to recognize it. But his opponent was so amped up, he was literally just. I think he might have even been an épée fencer. He was literally just fleshing, just like running through.
Yeah, that's it.
Basically almost every single attack. I think that was the first time he had been in a longsword like final, and so he was probably super nervous. So he was just like, "I'm gonna go," because since then he fences very differently. He's actually a great fencer.
I love that story, by the way. I wasn't there for that one because that was way before my time, but I've heard that story probably 3 times, and I still like to hear it every single time you bring it up. It's so good. Well, actually, that brings up the next question. Gear for longsword. What would you recommend to start with? And not swords. We'll talk about swords in a second. But specifically like just the gear that you wear.
Pro gauntlets.
I would actually 100% disagree with that.
If you can find one.
I don't think beginners should start with pro gauntlets. I don't think they should even be in the absolutely. Okay. I was pretty sure you were being sarcastic.
Longsword at least.
No, I don't think that they should start
$500 on gloves anyways.
Right. No, I to me it's like if you're not starting with lobster with the clamshell lobster spec gauntlet things, then you're doing it wrong, because those are like the most protective things that exist, and as a beginner you're going to get your hands hit a lot. Even conings, like, no, you don't want that.
No.
Yeah. So definitely gloves. I would say every beginner should start with the lobster gloves. A jacket, which means a padded jacket. The spec ones are great. And pants. Fencing pants, I guess.
You don't need pants for fencing.
Yeah, that's true. What you do need is hosen. Hosen for fencing.
So I'm gonna say you need, other than a sword, but don't worry about the sword. Actually, you don't need a sword to start out with. You need 3 items for if you're assuming that you are doing partner work, right? You should have 3 items, and in the order of importance, they are mask, gloves, and jacket. That being said, try to get all 3 of those things at the same time, because it's just better if you can. But masks and gloves are the most important. Then jacket. You don't even need. Well, I know we're going to talk about swords, but you don't even need a sword to start out with. You can use a broom handle. You can use a stick. Lots of things that you can start learning how to swing. That you absolutely don't need a sword for. I mean, historically, like saber was, I know was largely taught with a stick.
Single
right?
stick.
Single stick, right? So you don't need a sword to learn sword fighting.
Yeah.
Eventually you will, but yeah. So mask, jacket, or mask, gloves, and jacket in that order. But if you can, try to get them at the same time. And there are a lot of people selling like used gear.
Oh yeah.
There's like a Facebook group, right?
Yeah, there's like Facebook groups, and there's honestly there's a lot of cheap gear. It's so much cheaper for a beginner to get into now than it was even just a couple of years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's something that I think would be important for like a person who's starting to get into it is asking around, looking at reviews and stuff, because like if you're a person who's concerned about injury, for example, like you might be prone to buying the heaviest, bulkiest jacket and pants that exist. Like if you're getting Spess Hussar pants and the thickest axle or the thickest AP jacket that you can find, you're gonna be like very burdened and very like encumbered and weighed down. And you don't need the lightest thing, but you also, I think, you like just because like you're concerned about getting hurt, there is very good like mid range like the standard AP jacket is fine. I think it's not too heavy, it's not too light. I have switched over to the AP light jacket myself, but I would not encourage anyone to do that until they understand how to defend themselves, because like even though I've got a plastron on underneath, it's still not impossible for me to take a really hard shot to the ribs if I'm not paying attention and crack a rib or something like that, because it is lighter. But if you know how to defend yourself, that's okay. But point being, like, you don't need the heaviest, strongest, most protectivist ever thing in the world to start with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know we're talking longsword. If you're doing like a rapier, like sport fencing jackets are great. Like start with that. Don't worry about getting a HEMA jacket.
One of my favorite modifications that I've ever done was turn a sport fencing jacket into like a faux Renaissance shirt, so that it sort of looks like a Renaissance shirt, but it's actually like a sport jacket.
Yeah.
Pretty cool looking one too.
And
Thanks,
one
man.
more thing to add to what Nathan was saying is that if you have a coach and you have a club, ask them what they recommend. Don't go on the internet first. You can go on the internet, right? But the first people you should ask are the people you're learning from and your club mates.
Don't listen to us. We're the worst judges.
Always have new students come in, and like they come to their first class, and the next thing I see is like a post on the HEMA Alliance. What sword should I get? What thing did it? And it's like, okay, that's fine, but
you should buy 2 Albion Myers for your first month.
it's like the best person you should talk to are the people that you're actually going to be training with, if they have more experience than you, because one, they know what you're going to be doing, right? And two, they have the experience, right? People on the internet say some crazy things.
And it's hard to weed out like which opinions are coming from like a really good background of experience, and which opinions are just like, yeah, I've been doing this in my backyard for 6 months and
Stabbing people through arms and stuff.
yeah.
That being said, if your coach says something that sounds really weird to you and bizarre, then maybe you should ask some other people about it. Because I definitely heard some coaches or instructors giving some bizarre advice.
Yeah.
So that does exist as well.
So to go back to a little bit to a point that Nathan was kind of making, I think we all were kind of making this point, but just to make it explicit, generally speaking, you buy a certain level of gear for protection when you're a student. Like you need to have enough protection. I think enough is the key word there. And then as you start to improve, as your fencing improves, you essentially gear down. Like you start getting less of the protective stuff, and you start valuing mobility above protection, just so that you can move better, you can do the moves more accurately, and you don't have to worry so much about all of the hard hits, because you're just not taking as many, because you know how to defend yourself.
Which is historically attested to in armored combat, wof like they would sometimes prefer to not wear a visor because you can't see anything.
Yep, that's literally how Bergenets came about, where they were like, kind of want to see, though. Crossbows suck, but I also want to see the other guy.
Yeah, I mean,
if I can see the bolts coming, I can dodge them.
Yeah, I mean, there are helmets where when you're like this, it's like that, and you're like, oh crap, there's an arrow, and now I'm safe. All right, there we go.
Or like that line from one of my favorite movies of all time, which is the We Will Ride, the Heath Ledger was, oh no, I'm blanking on it.
A Knight's Tale.
A Knight's Tale, thank you. And A Knight's Tale, where he's like, well, when you're jousting, most experienced jousters know to turn their head a certain way so that the visor, they don't get struck in the visor. This guy is fearless because he just doesn't do it, or he doesn't know what he's doing, is the implication there. But yeah, that's right. That's like one of those, like, maybe they actually did some research for this. I don't know, but yeah.
Well, except I don't think that's really true. I don't know much about jousting now.
Well, yeah,
But
actually,
most jousting helmets are basically just a wall in front of your face. And
Oh yeah, the ones that look like the frog.
yeah, like you look at this, and then you do actually pull your head up at the last second.
Yeah.
So that it doesn't come in. So I guess that is kind of true.
yes, and the character that was saying that actually had a frog helmet. So it was like, did you research for this movie? I mean, good job. I'm just surprised. They also
Go ahead.
The other thing that they actually did research is when he does actually compete in Longsword, because we're talking in Longsword, they armor up and they have like their own tournament longsword armor, and they're just wailing on each other over top of a barricade, which is historical.
Yeah.
So A Knight's Tale, the we will rock you in the stands of the jousting competition. They did research for that.
100% accurate.
with drunken homeless Geoffrey Chaucer. That was great. Speaking of jousting, real quick, I assume that you guys know that like King Henry VIII sustained a major like life-altering jousting accident, right?
Yeah, it was like a hard concussion or something, and he turned into a jerk.
Yeah. So I was looking up the other day, and the accident was taking a lance to the face with his visor up.
Oh, was it one of the like the ball?
I assume so, but like it just said that like he forgot to put his visor down and he took a lance blow to the face.
He forgot, aka he was too drunk to remember.
Guys, look at how cool I am.
I think he was probably drunk because he was a party king, right? Like
but I think isn't that like because in his young days he was like super fit,
like Robert Baratheon before
yeah, and like was a superb like warrior and stuff like that,
and everybody loved him.
One of the theories that he received like such a bad concussion that like it damaged his like executive lobe. So he just started eating everything and killing everyone and like doing all these things that he didn't do before because he had lost like the ability, like some of the ability, like when people have really bad concussions, it can really mess your head up.
Yeah, actually, so I've heard that one, and it's like really specific too, because they're like this event happened, and all of these past kingly maneuvers that he's made, he's been very peaceful and very like on the side of diplomacy. And then after that accident, he just basically was just like, nah, just kill him. Why am I bothering with this?
Yeah,
he was unconscious for something like 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah, that's never a good. If you go unconscious, it's never a good thing.
Yeah.
No.
I will say concussions are definitely something that plague us in HEMA Longsword. To bring it back to Longsword again, definitely something that plagues us. And there's not too much we can do about it, but there is something very specific we can do, and it's get a flexible sword. For Christ's sake, get a flexible sword.
Yeah, but how am I going to bind?
So let's talk about swords.
Just do Meyer.
Let's talk about swords, though. So we actually already talked about this question, which was there's obviously differences between the different fetters or wasters you can buy, right? There's wooden ones, there's nylon ones, and there's steel trainers. Mostly at VAF, students start with nylon swords, the Rawlings synthetics, right? And then they eventually move to steel. Wood definitely has its place for sparring and like just like backyard stuff, backyard shenanigans, or just like trying to learn different things. But it doesn't react right. Nylon is a better steel simulator, but still also like a simulation, and it doesn't bind right. So generally speaking, you want to go to steel. When you get to that level, when you get enough gear to do steel, 100% steel is the way to go. I would say. I don't think you guys would say anything different. in
No,
that
we
regard.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nylon to steel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, talking about buying steel, actually, I have a question from one of our patrons. What are some common mistakes new buyers make when purchasing a longsword? Is the first question, and this is from Steve Andrides. What do you guys think?
Well, one is spending too much money.
Yeah, I would say that's like the number one thing is they spend too much money.
They think they need to get like the best one out there, and for a beginner, you definitely don't.
Yeah, and for two reasons. One, you can always resell them, and two, swords break, and I think that as a HEMA community, we need to understand that broken swords are not faulty swords. That swords break sometimes, and it stinks, and you have to buy a new one. But don't spend $1,000 on a sword. Because it's something that you're going to use. I say that with the Jesse Belsky stuff in the background that I spent way too much money on, but the important thing is that you don't spend a bunch of money and you don't like cry yourself to sleep after your sword breaks. It's much better to spend less, get a sword that works, and go from there.
Yeah, now is the best time to be starting longsword because there are more and more and more manufacturers competing with each other, which is one, just driven prices actually down, and two, it means that there's more and more options and out there and what's available, which is good. And
Stiggy exists.
Some of the best fetters and training swords out there on the market are actually not the most expensive ones.
Yeah, which is fantastic. Like Siggy makes a fantastic longsword, several different kinds of fantastic longswords, and all of them are generally cheaper. Reginier, I know they make great stuff. Sorry, what?
VB.
Yeah, and the VB, yeah, exactly. The VB fetters are great. Like they work, and they're not that. I think they're like around $200-300, right?
Yeah, I think, and I tell my guys this as well. Like, if you're in the U.S., VB should probably be like your entry level fetter. And in Europe, Regeniers are quite a bit cheaper because you don't have to worry about like the shipping overseas and all that stuff. And I think you can actually get a VB for cheaper in Europe than you can get a Regenier for here. No, I'm sorry, the other way around. You can get a Regenier cheaper in Europe than you can get a VB for here. But even so, VBs are like they're fine.
Yeah.
The one thing that's sad is that in Europe, both Regenier and VB, there's so many different options for what you can get. And here in the US, because they have to like the people that are distributing here like need to obviously not like lose money on this, so that they're not really doing many like custom orders. So it's mostly like, okay, we're gonna bring over this type, and then we're gonna sell that type. Whereas you can it's not even so much customizing, but in Europe you can there's just a lot more options available. Like you can get this blade with this amount of flex, or that amount of flex, or this amount of flex, and it's the same blade. Whereas when you order it in the US, it's like this is with some exceptions. It'd be like this is the flex you get. But that is changing as well.
I would say the other thing that beginners make, the other mistake that beginners make is when they go to purchase their first longsword, they don't return it when they don't like it. So a lot of times beginners will get their longsword and they're like, wow, this feels really different. And it's tough because as a beginner, you don't really know what you're looking for. But sometimes you can just tell, like, this is too heavy. I want to try something else. So you maybe hold on to that one or return it or see what else is on the market kind of deal. Try to find what's right for you. Though I would still say the VB fetters, for all intents and purposes, if you're in the United States, that's what you should probably look at. I always pronounce it Regenier, but Regenier, the Regeniers in Europe, I think, are pretty much the standard entry-level swords. You can't really go wrong there. Well, obviously, a Albion Meyer, probably not what you want. Even if you can get a hold of one, probably not good for your like entry-level steel.
One more thing, VB, like Purple Heart Armory, right? In the US sells VB stuff. they make the technique the training swords. You don't need a feather schwert to start. This is a feather schwert. This is a fencing sword that this is a tournament sword, right?
Mm-hmm.
For training and for lower level sparring, you don't need one of these. You want one of these if you're going to a tournament usually because there are certain advantages that these have. A feather it's a longsword foil, for lack of a better term. I mean, that's literally what it is. It is a training or a safe version of a longsword. But you can get the VB technique feather. I think it's $200, something like that.
Yeah.
Technique.
Super reasonable.
And it's for a beginner. It's a great option to start with.
Yeah, I mean, you obviously let students spar with those in your school, I would say. Yeah, so
Yeah, I mean, well, beginners also need to be they should spar as soon as possible, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
But they also need to be very carefully managed. And I don't mean no, you're doing it wrong. You just have to be all right, let's stop. Let's talk about what happened, because beginners will go crazy.
Yeah.
At the same time, they're not going to learn if they're not hitting each other.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't want too much. Actually, you don't want to ever overcorrect, especially at the beginning, because then the person just gets upset and leaves.
Yeah.
But you also can't let them go crazy.
So the next.
Yeah, go ahead.
The next part of that question, is from Steve. Is, are there features people over or undervalue? And I would say this is actually more like a second steel longsword purchase question. So what do you guys think? Are there features people over or undervalue in a longsword?
Nathan, you go first.
Features you mean like physical components, or like aspects, not aspects, but like flexibility of the blade?
Yeah, like those kind of features, like a spatulated tip over a rolled one, or having a shield versus not, or the length of a crossguard, or the length of a grip, or the weight of a pommel, point of balance. Take your pick.
Okay, so I'll answer the question in a roundabout way that I think makes it a little bit more concise. The things that I think matter the most, especially to a beginner or to somebody who's just starting out, getting a steel sword, is making sure that you have a tip that is rolled or is otherwise big enough. And sometimes rolled does not mean it's big enough. Like, you look at the I think it's the Ensifer's. Those tips come to a taper, but they're rolled, and they've gone through people's hands before.
They're also pretty stiff.
They're very stiff as well. That's the second thing that I was going to get to is the flexibility of the blade, right? You could have a sword that's got a rolled tip, and maybe it's an Ensifer, or maybe it's got a bit wider of a tip, but it will hit like a freight train when you thrust if it doesn't bend. So those are the two things that matter the most. I think pommel doesn't really matter. That's personal preference. Grip length, as long as you can fit both of your hands in there, that also really doesn't matter, and neither does crossguard size or blade weight. I mean, as long as the blade bends when it's supposed to bend, so you don't hurt people, and it's rolled in such a manner that you don't hurt people, those are really the only things that matter the most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so since you brought it up, let's talk about it. Let's talk about blade flexibility, because it's something that I think has kind of plagued longswords for a long time. David and I have talked about this, and I think I've talked about this with you too, Nathan. There's just everything seems to be way too stiff, and it seems to be like the trend, at least if you look at the VB fetters specifically, the trend towards having a stiffer blade seems to be something that the public, well, I say the public, but most HEMA practitioners will clamor for. Hey, we really want this to be stiffer. I think that it's a little bit too flexible. But what I think is actually happening is you get a lot of artifacts in your training from having too stiff a sword. Rather than thrusting somebody and thrusting somebody, you end up being I don't really want to kill you, so I'm not going to thrust so hard. Whereas that is actually not, it's counterproductive to their training.
Yeah. So there's two factors as to why that's the case. One is that there was this idea from a while back that a stiffer sword, which it's not necessarily wrong, but it actually, in my opinion, is wrong. But that a stiffer sword allows you to bind better,
Mhm.
and therefore by having a stiffer sword, we would see more binding and winding in longsword. I actually think it's actually completely the other way around. I found that the more I've trained with floppy swords, like the old Hanley fetish shirts, which are super floppy, you have to be able to bind really, really delicately because they are floppy. So, anyways, that's one reason, and the second reason is people have this expectation that their sword is not going to break. That they're going to buy a sword and then they're going to use it forever, or they're going to use it for 5 years. And so manufacturers have responded to that by making thick, stiff swords that can absorb lots and lots of abuse before they break, um, which is actually completely unhistorical. Most historical training blades were, again, like foils because they break and you just buy a new blade and replace it, and they break and you buy a new blade. For those when they did have training. Even sharp swords were like that.
Mm.
Modern swords are tempered to a much higher degree than historical swords were because you just weren't bashing on another sword with it all day. So you didn't need the same level. So, yeah, like Nathan said, flexibility. This is a Siggy. I actually don't even have a tip on this currently. It has this flared tip, so it widens there, but it also widens, it swells this way. But you honestly, it's so flexible. Like it's like a fencing, like a sport foil. It's so flexible that you really don't even need a tip because it's wide enough. It's totally safe in the thrust. Um, it's safer than like an epee is, because it's a wider tip than an epee is.
Yeah.
So that's definitely one thing. So people often, I think, overlook that. So flexibility, in my opinion, is the most important thing. Get a flexible sword and one with a safe tip. And then I kind of agree with Nathan there. Everything else is pretty much personal preference.
Mm-hmm.
Couple things to be aware of. The wider your crossguard is, the easier it is to protect your hands, and the more it will get in the way. So there's a trade-off there. Like the Siggy has really wide crossguard, which is nice for using the crossguard to parry, but it also gets in the way, especially if your gear is bulky. And actually, I might at some point have like Jesse Bilski, like either put a new guard on this or take a couple of like an inch off either side here because it's actually, in my opinion, it's too wide.
Yeah.
And like grip length, again, you need a sword that's like the hilt is long enough that you can hold it with your gloves. Most modern swords have hilts that are longer than a lot of historical examples, precisely for the fact that we're wearing big, heavy gloves.
Mm-hmm.
So, almost everything else, for a beginner, it's not that important. Once you know what you're doing, then you'll get a better idea of what you like, and then from there you can kind of like specialize. Okay, I want this type of blade, and I want this type of crossguard, and this type of grip, and this type of pommel. It's really not that important for a beginner.
Yeah, I would even say that one of the things that people kind of I read this a lot, and maybe it's not true, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. That a lot of people online will say something along the lines of, "Oh, point of balance needs to be at this certain point of the blade, or else it's bad." Like there's some sort of like idea that point of balance is more of an objective truth than anything else.
No, that's entirely a
Right.
personal preference thing.
So I think that's a big misconception where you just want to find a sword with the point of balance that you like. And to that end, I really enjoy the fact that Jesse Belsky and there's other sword makers that do this as well, have pommels of different weights that will be happy to exchange a pommel for you to try to get to whatever point of balance you're really looking for. It doesn't make a huge difference, but I mean, we're talking about centimeters of point of balance, but sometimes that's enough to like change your outlook or change your feeling in a bind or feeling whatever. I also kind of wanted to talk about specifically the crossguard, but David pretty much covered it. As I will show you, have a tiny crossguard for the exact reason that David said. I disliked to an extreme the VB Feder crossguards that came out like 12 inches. This one's 8. And it suits me beautifully. This is, by the way, a Castile Feder Mark V, mounted on custom guard and pommel and crossguard from Mr. Belsky, who will be joining us next week, actually, to talk about sword making. So
Exciting.
I'm gonna agree with you about point of balance, and then I'm gonna disagree with you.
Okay.
There's one thing so I don't think it matters that much, but for a beginner, if you're gonna err one way, you want to err towards having the balance closer to the hands, because you don't want as much blade presence, because you're gonna hit harder, and the sword's gonna be a little bit harder to control if the weight is further out. So back, you'll be able to manipulate the sword easier as a beginner. But that's a very minute thing.
But I actually think that's a fantastic point, because I mean, one of the things that the two things that you guys talked about as being the most important things are flexibility and tip, specifically because that's what makes the sword safe to use and to use correctly. So I would say that yes, I agree. A 2-point forward sword is unsafe. But I would hope that most sword makers would not put the weight of the sword that far forward. We know that for a fact that that's not true, and that they will, do their thing. But yeah, I agree. I think that there's a certain point where it's like, this is objectively bad, but in between, like, is it 6 centimeters? Is it 10 or 12? Like, that's very much a personal opinion, right? Hello, everybody out in the HEMAverse. It's Colin. I have to apologize. We had to end this episode pretty abruptly one of us had to make an appointment that couldn't be missed. But thank you for listening all the way to the end to this episode on longswords. I hope that you enjoyed it, and we hope to do at least one episode on each of the primary weapons of HEMA in the coming weeks, as almost a mini-series, if you will. Also, we hope you'll tune in next week. We've got a great episode for you with our guest star Jesse Belsky from Jesse Belsky Stage Swords, which we talked about a lot in this episode. He will be on to talk about sword making, and it should be a really interesting episode where maybe we'll all learn something. So thanks again, and see you next week.